Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
You know how you often hear things like, study finds X is linked to Y, or maybe research suggests Z causes W.
All the time. Those headlines grab your attention.
Exactly. Well, today, we're diving deep into the specific research strategy that lets scientists make that really strong claim, that one thing actually causes another.
We're talking about the experimental research strategy. It's really the gold standard for figuring out causality in many fields.
And our guide for this is a key chapter from, well, a really foundational textbook in the field, Research Methods for the Behavioral Sciences, 6th ed.
A solid source. We'll be pulling out the core ideas from it.
Right. So our mission today is to break down the essential components. What makes a true experiment? How does it actually work?
And importantly, what challenges do researchers run into when they're trying to prove cause and effect? And how do they, tackle them?
Yeah, get ready to understand the engine driving those powerful research conclusions you hear about.
Let's get into it.
So let's start right at the most basic level. What's the ultimate goal? Why use this experimental approach?
The number one goal is to establish a cause and effect relationship, plain and simple.
Okay, cause and effect, meaning?
Meaning showing that changes in one variable are directly responsible for causing changes in a second variable. Think, A literally makes B happen.
Which is a much, much stronger statement than just saying A and B tend to show up together.
But no, absolutely. That's the critical difference. You might have other strategies like correlational studies, maybe descriptive ones.
Which can show links, associations.
Exactly. They can show really strong relationships. Maybe variable A and variable B move perfectly in sync, but correlation doesn't prove causation.
The classic phrase.
It's classic for a reason. It can't tell you if A causes B or if maybe B causes A or, and this is a big one, if some third thing is causing both A and B to change.
So only an experiment lets you isolate that causal arrow.
Only a true experiment, designed correctly, can really let you demonstrate causality with confidence.
Got it. So if it's the only way to claim cause and effect, what are the absolute must-haves? What defines a true experiment according to the source?
Okay, there are 4 foundational requirements. Think of them as the pillars. First up is manipulation.
Manipulation.
This means the researcher actively changes or manipulates the value of one variable. They create different conditions or experiences for the participants.
So you're not just passively observing something, you are making a change happen.
Precisely. You're intervening.
Okay.
Second, measurement.
Okay.
So after you've manipulated that first variable, you measure a second variable in each of those different conditions you created.
You're looking for the effect of your change.
Exactly, which leads to the third element, comparison.
Makes sense. You compare the measurements.
Right. You compare the scores, the measurements from the different conditions. Are they different? Did the manipulation seem to matter?
Okay. Manipulation, measurement, comparison. What's the fourth?
And this one is, well, arguably the most challenging, but also the most crucial. Control.
Control.
You have to control all other variables that could potentially influence the outcome you're measuring. Everything else needs to be held steady, or at least accounted for.
You have to rule out those alternative explanations we talked about.
That's the core of it. Eliminate the maybe something else caused it possibility.
Control definitely sounds like where the real heavy lifting happens. The source uses a great example, right? Comparing different studies on video game violence.
Yes, it's a perfect illustration. So the source brings up a survey study, Gentile and colleagues. They looked at kids.
And they found a relationship.
They found a relationship, yeah. Kids who reported playing more violent video games also tended to show more hostility, more aggression. There was a link.
But crucially, they couldn't say the games caused the aggression.
Exactly right, because, like the source points out, maybe kids who are already more aggressive are just drawn to playing those types of games.
So the aggression could be driving the game choice. The arrow could point the other way.
Or maybe there's a third variable. Perhaps something like parenting style or the environment they live in influences both their game preferences and their level of aggression.
So it's just a correlation. Causality is still murky.
Very murky. And this is where the experimental strategy shines. The source contrasts that survey with an experimental study by Pullman and colleagues.
Okay, so what did Pullman do differently?
They didn't just observe, they manipulated the key variable. They took a group of boys, and this is important, they randomly assigned them to one of 2 conditions.
Randomly assigned.
Yes. One group played a violent video game, the other group played a non-violent game. That assignment and the creation of those 2 distinct game-playing experiences That's the manipulation.
So they specifically directed which type of game the kids played. That intervention is the key difference.
It's a huge difference. Then they measured aggressive behavior afterwards. They observed the kids during free play.
Okay, so manipulation, then measurement.
Then they compared the aggression levels. Were the boys who played the violent game different from those who played the nonviolent one?
And the control part.
Crucially, they controlled other variables. For instance, they used only boys of a specific age, like 10-year-olds. They kept the lab setting consistent for everyone. And that random assignment we mentioned, that helps control for individual differences, things like personality, existing aggression levels, hoping to balance those out between the two groups just by chance.
Right, so random assignment tries to make the groups equal before the game playing happens.
Ideally, yes. So any difference seen after should be due to the manipulation, the game type.
And what did they find?
The boys who were assigned to play the violent game showed significantly more aggressive behavior afterward. And because they had manipulated the game type, measured the outcome, compared the groups, and controlled those other factors, then they could make the causal claim.
That playing the violent video games caused an increase in aggression, at least in that specific context.
Exactly. That active manipulation and careful control are what give the experiment its power to infer causality.
That example really nails the difference. Okay, let's dig into some of the specific terminology the source uses for experiments. You mentioned manipulating variables.
Absolutely. Getting the terms right is essential. First, the independent variable, often shortened to 4. This is the variable the researcher manipulates. It's the one they suspect is the cause.
So in the Pullman study, that IV was the type of video game.
Correct. And the specific variations of that 4, the different conditions created, are called the levels of the 4.
Okay, so violent game was one level and non-violent game was the other level.
Exactly. Then you have the dependent variable, or DV.
DV, that's the effect.
That's the variable the researcher measures to see if it's affected by the manipulation of the 4. It's the outcome, the hypothesized effect.
So in Pullman's study, aggressive behavior was the DV.
Yes. They measured it to see if it depended on the level of the IV the boys experienced.
Okay, IV is what you change, DV is what you measure. What about literally everything else that's part of the study situation?
Good question. Those are all extraneous variables, or EVs.
Extraneous, meaning outside the core IV-DV relationship.
Pretty much. It's all other variables present in the study environment or related to the participants.
So back to the video game example, 5E is game type, DV is aggression, EVs would be the individual boys' personalities.
Yep. Their personalities, their mood that day, maybe how much sleep they got, the temperature in the room, whether they knew the other kids.
Just tons of stuff.
Anything and everything that isn't the specific variable you chose to manipulate or the specific outcome variable you chose to measure. Participant characteristics, environmental factors, timing effects are all initially just EVs.
The source also gives a little nod to statistical significance. We don't need a stats lecture, but what's the basic idea there? Why mention it?
Right. No deep dive into p-values needed here. But the core idea is crucial. Even if you see a difference in your DV scores between your conditions, maybe the violent game group averaged slightly higher on aggression.
Yeah.
You need to know if that difference is actually meaningful or if it could have just happened by random chance.
Like just normal variation between groups.
Exactly. Statistical significance tests help researchers determine the probability that the observed difference is large enough and consistent enough to be considered a likely result of the IV manipulation, rather than just random fluctuation or noise in the data.
So it's a check. Is this difference big enough to take seriously as an effect of my IV?
It's a way to gauge confidence in the finding. A statistically significant difference suggests it's unlikely to be purely due to chance.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about ruling out chance as the explanation. Now let's get back to manipulation and control. You said they're critical for establishing causality. How do they actually solve the problems that plague other research methods?
They really are the power tools of the experimental method. They directly address 2 major obstacles to claiming cause and effect: the directionality problem and the third variable problem.
We touched on directionality with the video game's aggression causing game choice or vice versa. How does manipulation fix that?
By actively manipulating the IV, the researcher dictates the order. You introduce the change. First, you make the participants experience one level of the IV or another. Then you measure the DV.
So cause comes before effect because you made it happen that way.
Precisely. You establish the temporal sequence. The potential cause, your manipulation, definitely occurred before you measured the potential effect, the DV. This eliminates the ambiguity about which came first.
Like that temperature and ice cream sales example in the source. If you just watch them, they go up and down together.
Right. Correlation. You don't know if heat drives sales or, less likely, sales drive heat. But if you could manipulate temperature in a controlled setting,
Turn up the heat.
you'd likely see ice cream sales increase. But if you manipulated ice cream sales somehow, maybe gave away free cones, you wouldn't expect the temperature to change.
Oh, okay. Manipulation clarifies the direction of influence.
It makes the causal path much clearer. And this works even for tricky things, like the source mentions with depression and insomnia.
Right, they often go together. Does depression cause insomnia, or does insomnia contribute to depression?
It's a real chicken and egg problem observationally, and directly manipulating someone's level of depression is, well, difficult and unethical, but you could potentially manipulate sleep.
How?
You might, for example, have one group of participants maintain their normal sleep schedule, while another group has their sleep restricted for a few nights under controlled conditions. Then you measure their mood, maybe using a depression scale.
And if the sleep-restricted group shows higher depression scores?
Then your manipulation allows you to make a directional claim. In this context, restricting sleep caused an increase in depressive symptoms. You've shown that changing sleep leads to changes in mood.
Got it. So manipulation tackles directionality. What about the third variable problem? Like the temperature causing both ice cream sales and crime rates to rise in the summer.
Yeah, that's a classic example. If you only looked at ice cream sales and crime rates, you'd see a positive correlation. More ice cream, more crime.
Which sounds absurd as a direct cause.
It is. The third variable, rising temperature, is likely influencing both. Manipulation helps here because by imposing the change in the IV yourself, you break the natural covariation that might exist with some hidden third variable.
You're isolating your IV's effect.
You're trying to, but manipulation alone isn't always enough to kill the third variable problem. That's where control becomes absolutely paramount.
Okay, so how does control specifically deal with third variables?
Control is all about ensuring that the independent variable is the only thing that is changing systematically across your different conditions. If some other variable, an extraneous variable, also happens to change in lockstep with your IV.
Like maybe one group gets the treatment in a bright room and the control group is in a dim room.
Exactly. And if that other variable, room brightness, also has an effect on your dependent variable, maybe test performance, then you're sunk. You can't tell if the difference in performance was due to your treatment, the IV, or the room brightness, the EV that changed with the IV.
That sounds like a mess. Is there a name for that kind of problematic extraneous variable?
There is. It's called a confounding variable.
Okay.
Or sometimes just a confound.
Confounding.
Yeah.
Because it confuses the results.
Precisely. A confounding variable is an extraneous variable that meets two specific conditions. One, it influences the dependent variable, and two, it changes systematically along with the independent variable.
So it's not just any old EV floating around. It has to affect the outcome and be linked somehow to the different treatment condition.
Exactly right. It has to vary with the IV. The source uses a really good, simple example with cereal.
Oh, yeah, the cereal. Tell us about that.
Okay, imagine you want to see if kids prefer sweetened cereal. So you give one group a colorful sweetened cereal and another group a plain tan unsweetened cereal. And let's say the kids overwhelmingly prefer the colorful sweetened one. Great. But why?
Was it the sweetness? Or was it the bright colors?
Exactly. In this setup, color is an extraneous variable. Does color influence preference? Probably. And did color change systematically along with sweetness? Yes. Colorful went with sweet, tan went with unsweetened.
So sweetness and color are tangled up. They're confounded.
Perfectly put. They are confounded. You cannot possibly tell from that result whether sweetness caused the preference, color caused the preference, or maybe some combination of both.
So how do you fix that? How do you use control?
You use control techniques to break that link. For instance, you could hold color constant.
Oh.
Make both cereals colorful. So now you have a colorful sweetened cereal versus a colorful unsweetened cereal. Color is still present, but it's the same in both conditions. It no longer varies systematically with the IV sweetness.
So now if the kids still prefer the sweetened one,
then you can be much more confident that sweetness is the active ingredient driving the preference because color has been ruled out as a confound.
that makes it really clear. And the source points out, right, that whether something is your IV or a potential confound really depends on what you're asking.
Absolutely. If your hypothesis was about color preference, you'd manipulate color and maybe hold sweetness constant. It all depends on your research question.
Okay, so researchers need to anticipate these potential confounds. How do they figure out which EVs are the likely culprits? Is it just guesswork?
It's not pure guesswork, though there's an element of anticipation. The source suggests it's often based on common sense, logical thinking, and knowledge from previous research or practical experience.
So what's already known to affect the behavior I'm studying?
Exactly. And which of those known factors might accidentally get linked to my IV levels in the way I'm planning to run the study? Those are the high priority threats you need to actively control.
Right. Identify the biggest risks. Okay, so we know we need to control these extraneous variables to prevent confounding. The source outlines 3 main strategies or techniques for achieving control.
Yes, 3 primary methods: holding constant, matching, and randomization.
Let's take them one by one. Tell us about holding constant.
Holding a variable constant is probably the most direct way to control it. You simply prevent it from varying at all across your participants or conditions.
Like making sure every single participant is tested in the exact same room.
Exactly. Or at the same time of day with the same instructions delivered by the same researcher. Another way is to restrict the range of participant characteristics.
Like only studying people within a very narrow age range, say 18 to 21.
Precisely. Or only studying females, or only people with a certain level of experience. You make that variable uniform for everyone in the study.
So everyone has the identical experience on that specific factor.
Correct. The huge advantage, the pro, is that it completely eliminates that variable as a potential confound. If it doesn't vary, it can't vary systematically with the IV.
Makes sense. What's the downside?
The main con is that it can seriously limit the study's external validity.
External validity.
Right.
That's generalizability, right?
Exactly. If you conduct a study only on 19-year-old male college students in a specific lab setting, how confident are you that the results apply to 60-year-old women in a different country?
Not very confident. Probably you've controlled that variable, but maybe made your findings less applicable elsewhere.
That's the trade-off. Excellent control for that specific variable, but potentially poor generalizability.
Okay, method 2, matching. What's involved there?
Matching is a bit different. Instead of making a variable identical for everyone, you ensure that the level or average value of that variable is balanced across your different treatment conditions.
So you don't eliminate the variation, you just spread it out evenly.
That's the idea. For example, if you're concerned about gender potentially confounding your results, you could match by making sure each treatment group has the same proportion of males and females.
Or if IQ is concerned, you could try to make the average IQ score roughly the same in each group.
Exactly. Or maybe balance age, ensuring a similar distribution of younger and older participants in each condition. The source also mentions counterbalancing here, which is essentially matching applied to time-related factors.
Like the order in which people experience treatments.
Right. Ensuring that different orders are equally represented across conditions to balance out practice effects or fatigue effects. That's covered more in Chapter 9, apparently, but it's a form of matching.
So what's the benefit of matching?
The main benefit is that, like holding constant, it prevents the matched variable from becoming a confound. Because it's balanced across groups, its variation isn't systematically linked to the IV.
But you still have variation within the groups, which might help external validity compared to holding constant.
Potentially, yes. The downside or consideration is that matching requires extra effort. You have to identify the variable you want to match on, measure it for each participant before assigning them to conditions, and then actively ensure the balance is maintained.
Okay, so holding constant and matching are quite active, deliberate strategies for controlling specific, known potential confounds. What's the third method?
The third method is randomization, and this is probably the most common and in some ways most powerful technique.
Randomization. That sounds like leaving it to chance.
In a very specific way, yes. Randomization uses an unpredictable, unbiased procedure, think flipping a coin, using a random number table or generator to distribute extraneous variables across the different treatment conditions.
The key example being random assignment.
Exactly. Random assignment is using a random process to decide which treatment condition each participant will experience.
So participant 1 comes in, flip a coin. Heads, they go to group A. Tails, they go to group B.
That's the basic principle. The fundamental goal is that by using chance to assign participants, all their individual differences, age, gender, IQ, personality, mood, prior knowledge, everything should, in theory, get distributed randomly and therefore roughly evenly across the different groups.
It relies on the idea that if the assignment is random, there shouldn't be any systematic bias making one group different from another before the treatment starts.
Precisely. The random process itself disrupts or breaks any potential systematic relationship between those countless EVs and your IV, which group they end up in.
So it's powerful because it tries to control many EVs simultaneously, even ones you haven't thought of.
That's its huge advantage. You don't need to identify, measure, and match every single potential EV. Randomization is a more passive approach that aims to handle them all at once. The pro is its efficiency and breadth.
What's the catch? Is there a con?
The main con is that it relies on chance. It's not guaranteed to produce perfectly balanced groups, especially if your sample size is small.
Yeah, okay. So with just 10 people per group, you could get unlucky and, just by chance, end up with most of the really motivated people in one group.
It could happen. With larger sample sizes, random assignment becomes much more reliable in balancing things out. But with small n, there's a greater risk of chance creating pre-existing group differences that could act like confounds.
So how do researchers decide which method to use?
The source suggests a combination is often best. Use active control, holding constant or matching for any really obvious major potential confounds you're particularly worried about. Then use random assignment to take care of all the other innumerable EVs. But understand randomization works better with larger groups.
Right. Active control for the big known threats, randomization for the rest. The source has that table concept showing how IQ could be a confound and how each method addresses it, which helps visualize it.
Yeah, it shows the difference between IQ varying systematically with the condition, confounding, versus being held constant, matched across conditions, or randomly distributed.
Okay, beyond these general techniques for controlling EVs, the source talks about some special kinds of controls. Control conditions and manipulation checks.
Yes, these are important refinements. Control conditions are specific types of comparison groups used when you're primarily interested in evaluating the effect of a single treatment.
So not always comparing two different active treatments, but maybe one treatment against nothing.
Exactly. You have your experimental condition. That's the group that receives the treatment or the level of the IV you're interested in. And then you might compare them to a control condition, which represents a baseline or comparison point.
And there are different kinds of control conditions.
Two main types discussed here. The simplest is the no treatment control condition.
Sounds straightforward.
It is. Participants in this group simply don't receive the treatment or intervention being studied. They get zero level of the IV. Their behavior serves as a baseline of what happens normally without the specific intervention.
Okay. What's the other type?
The other is the placebo control condition. This one's really interesting, especially in medical and psychological research.
The placebo effect.
Exactly. Participants in a placebo control group receive a bogus treatment, something designed to look, feel, and seem like the real treatment, but which has no active ingredient or therapeutic component. Think a sugar pill instead of a real drug, or maybe a sham therapy session.
Why go to that trouble? Why not just use the no treatment group?
Because of the powerful placebo effect. This is a genuine psychological or even physiological response that occurs simply because a person believes they are receiving an effective treatment. Their expectation can actually lead to real changes.
So people can feel better just because they think they're getting helped.
Yes. And sometimes the opposite, the nocebo effect, where expecting side effects makes you feel them. So the placebo control group is essential to disentangle the true effect of the active treatment component from the effect generated purely by expectation and the context of receiving treatment.
Ah, I see. So how do you use the comparisons?
Well, if you compare the experimental group, real treatment, to the placebo group, fake treatment, the difference tells you about the effect of the active ingredient above and beyond the placebo effect.
That's the specific effect of the drug or therapy itself.
Right. And if you compare the placebo group to the no treatment group, the difference gives you an estimate of the size of the placebo effect itself in that context.
That helps clarify if a treatment package works mostly because of its active parts or just because people believe it will work.
Exactly. It ties into what the source calls outcome research versus process research. Outcome research asks, does the whole treatment package work? Process research asks, what specific parts of this treatment are causing the effect, and needs to separate out placebo effects.
That's a critical distinction. And the source is careful to point out, right, that you don't always need a placebo or no treatment control group.
Absolutely. Essential point. Control conditions like these are optional, used depending on the research question, but control of extraneous variables using methods like holding constant, matching, or randomization is always required for a study to be considered a true experiment.
Got it. Control conditions are tools for specific comparisons. Control of EVs is fundamental. Now, what about manipulation checks?
Okay, manipulation checks are another layer of verification. It's basically an additional measure included in the study specifically to check if the independent variable manipulation actually worked as intended.
Worked how? Like, did it actually create the difference between groups that you planned?
Yes, and did it have the intended psychological impact on the participants? Did they notice the manipulation if it was subtle? Did they interpret it the way you expected?
How would you actually check that during the experiment?
There are a couple of ways. You could include an explicit measure of the construct you tried to manipulate. For instance, if your IV was designed to induce frustration, you might give participants a short frustration questionnaire right after the manipulation phase.
See if the frustration group actually reports feeling more frustrated.
Exactly. Or, if the manipulation was more subtle, like a slight change in room lighting meant to affect mood, you might embed questions in a post-experiment questionnaire. Something like, did you notice any changes in the room environment during the study? Or, how bright did you find the room lighting?
Okay, when are these manipulation checks considered particularly important?
The source highlights a few key situations. One is when you're manipulating the participant directly, their mood, their level of motivation, inducing stress, etc. You need to verify they actually experienced that intended internal state.
Makes sense. What else?
Also important for subtle manipulations. If you just change a few words and instructions, you want to know if participants even noticed or if it registered. They're crucial when using placebo controls. You want to check if participants in both the real treatment group and the placebo group actually believed they might be getting an effective treatment. If the placebo group saw right through it, it's not serving its purpose.
Ah, good point.
And finally, they're often used in simulations. If you create a simulated environment, you need to check if participants actually bought into it, felt immersed, and accepted the reality you created.
It seems like just good practice, really.
Yeah.
You need to make sure the part of your cause and effect equation was actually implemented properly before you draw conclusions about the effect.
It's exactly that. It's a check on the construct validity of your manipulation. Did you really manipulate what you intended to manipulate? Very important step.
Okay. So we spent a lot of time on manipulation and especially control. Achieving that high level of control often means conducting experiments in a laboratory setting, right? Where you can really standardize things.
That's often the case, yes. Labs offer the highest degree of control over the environment and procedures.
But doesn't that create a potential issue? You gain all this beautiful control, but the lab situation might be kind of artificial, maybe not like the real world at all.
That's the fundamental tension. It's the trade-off between internal validity and external validity.
Define those again for us quickly.
Sure. Internal validity refers to the confidence you have that the changes in your dependent variable were actually caused by your independent variable and not by some confounding variable. High control leads to high internal validity.
Okay. And external validity.
External validity refers to the extent to which the results of your study can be generalized to other populations, other settings, other times, basically to the real world outside the specific confines of your study.
So a super-controlled lab experiment might have great internal validity. You're sure the IV caused the DV in that lab, but maybe low external validity because the situation was so artificial.
That's exactly the concern. Sometimes, in maximizing control, researchers create situations that don't resemble everyday life, which can limit how broadly the findings apply.
So how do researchers try to bridge this gap? How do they try to increase external validity while still doing experimental work?
The source discusses two main strategies aimed at boosting realism and generalizability: simulation and field studies.
Let's start with simulation. What does that involve?
Simulation involves creating conditions within a controlled setting, often a lab, that are designed to simulate or closely mimic aspects of a natural environment or a real-world situation.
So trying to make the lab feel more like the real world.
Sort of. The source makes an important distinction here between mundane realism and experimental realism.
Okay, what's the difference?
Mundane realism is about the superficial physical similarity between the lab setting and the real world. Like, does the room look exactly like a real office? The source suggests this is often less critical.
And experimental realism.
Experimental realism is about the psychological impact of the simulation. Does the situation feel real to the participants? Are they genuinely engaged, immersed, and behaving naturally within the simulated context, even if it doesn't look exactly like the real world? This psychological immersion is considered much more important for a successful simulation.
Can you give an example?
Flight simulators are a classic example, designed for high experimental realism. The source also mentions the famous and controversial Stanford prison study.
Right, where students were assigned roles as prisoners or guards.
Yes, that study created a detailed simulated prison environment. The source highlights it as an example of achieving very high experimental realism. The participants became deeply immersed in their roles. Of course, it also highlights the serious ethical problems that arose precisely because the realism was so intense, leading to the study's early termination.
So, high experimental realism can be powerful, but needs careful ethical handling.
Absolutely. Other examples might be using very realistic case materials in a mock jury simulation to study decision-making. The focus is on making the experience feel authentic to the participant.
Okay, so simulation tries to bring realism into the lab. What about field studies?
Field studies take the opposite approach. They involve conducting the experiment outside the laboratory within the participant's natural environment.
Taking the experiment out into the wild, so to speak.
Exactly. You're still manipulating an IV and measuring a DV, but you're doing it in a real-world setting.
Like those bystander apathy studies where researchers might stage an emergency in a public place to see who helps.
That's a classic type of field experiment. Or the vending machines study the source mentions.
Right, putting different calorie information stickers on actual campus vending machines to see if it changed what students bought.
Perfect example. They manipulated the information in a real setting, the campus, and measured actual purchase behavior, DV. It's important to note, though, that not all research done in the field is experimental. You can do observational studies or surveys out in the real world, too, but a field experiment specifically involves manipulation and control in that natural setting.
Okay, so what are the pros and cons of using simulation or field studies to try and boost external validity?
The big pro for both is clear: the potential for increased realism. This, in turn, should lead to higher external validity. Findings from a more realistic setting are arguably more likely to generalize to other real-world situations.
Makes sense. What's the downside?
The major con for both is a loss of control over extraneous variables.
Back to the trade-off. You gain realism, but you potentially sacrifice internal validity.
Precisely. In a field study, think about all the things you can't control easily. Who walks by, the weather, background noise, other events happening simultaneously. Any of these could become confounds. You also have less control over participant selection, and assignment might be trickier.
In simulations?
Even in a simulation, participants usually know they're in a study, which can affect their behavior, demand characteristics, social desirability. And while you have more environmental control than in the field, creating and maintaining a truly immersive and fully controlled simulation can be incredibly complex and resource-intensive. Plus, its success hinges on participants genuinely buying into it.
So it's always this balancing act.
Right.
Researchers have to decide what's more important for their specific question: the tight control of the lab or the real-world context of the field or simulation.
It's a constant consideration. Sometimes you might even see researchers conduct a series of studies, maybe starting with a controlled lab experiment to establish basic causality, high internal validity, and then following up with a field study to check if the effect holds up in a more natural setting, testing external validity.
That makes a lot of sense, sort of building confidence step by step. Wow, okay, that feels like a really thorough journey through the experimental research strategy, drawing on all those core ideas from the source chapter.
Yeah, I think we've covered the main ground. We started with the primary goal, establishing cause and effect.
Right, then the four essential elements: manipulation, measurement, comparison, and that crucial element, control.
We talked about the key terminology: independent variable, dependent variable, extraneous variables.
And how manipulation and control are the tools experiments use to overcome the directionality problem and the third variable problem.
Which led us into defining confounding variables, those EVs that threaten our conclusions, and the three main techniques for controlling them: holding constant, matching, and randomization.
Comparing the pros and cons of each control technique.
Then we looked at special controls like no treatment and placebo control conditions, understanding the placebo effect, and the importance of manipulation checks to verify the IV worked.
And finally, we tackled that big tension between internal and external validity and how simulation and field studies are attempts to increase real-world relevance albeit with their own challenges regarding control.
It's a comprehensive strategy with lots of moving parts to consider when designing and evaluating research.
It definitely gives you a much deeper appreciation for what goes into a study that confidently claims X causes Y. It's not a simple thing to demonstrate.
Not at all. And understanding these components really empowers you as a listener or reader of research.
Absolutely. So why does this matter to you listening right now? Well, next time you see that headline or hear someone mention a study claiming causation.
You can think critically about it.
Exactly. You can ask, was this actually a true experiment? Did they manipulate the supposed cause? What did they measure? And maybe most importantly, what did they control for? Could something else explain these results?
It equips you to look beyond the surface claim and evaluate the evidence behind it much more effectively.
It really does. Okay, so here's a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Given how careful and controlled a true experiment needs to be, often in a somewhat artificial lab setting, to really nail down that cause and effect relationship, what are the limits? How do we best think about applying those very specific findings to the messy, complex, uncontrolled reality of our actual lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do researchers and how do we navigate that gap between the clean conclusions from the lab and the way things play out in the wild?
Something to keep in mind as you encounter research. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure. It was a great discussion.
We'll see you next time.